I would like to talk about the War on Terror. This is a relatively recent topic, at least in the light of history. What we'll talk about here dates back to 9/11, 2001. We'll look at before that and look at after that and some things that happened. But relatively recent history that is sometimes hard to get a grasp of because there's not enough distance to weed out all the insignificant things from the meat of what really happened. But I think there's enough here that's worth looking at to think about what's going on. So, the War on Terror. When 9/11 happened, when Al-Qaeda attacked us on that day, everything changed. Our whole view of terrorism changed, the way we approached it, the whole thing. What I'd like to do today is look before 9/11 at the situation of how our agencies work together and some of the weaknesses there, and then look at what Bush implemented, sometimes called the Bush Doctrine. He gave a speech on September the 20th, 9 days after 9/11, where he laid out 3 basic principles about how he's going to approach this war on terrorism. We'll start with the situation before 9/11, four things there that kind of made that possible. Please don't misconstrue any of this. The terrorists that did that are responsible. I mean, this was an unprovoked attack. It doesn't mean that there wasn't some things we could have been doing better, and that's what I look at here. There were some things in place that didn't make any sense prior to 9/11. These come out of the 9/11 Commission that studied this. So 4 problems, 4 conditions before 9/11 that kind of paved the way for that, or made it at least much easier for the terrorists to do what they did. So, all right, the first thing there before 9/11 were legal restrictions. Congress had placed all kinds of legal restrictions on our investigative agencies. Again, there's legitimate reasons to put restrictions on what the FBI and the CIA and police agencies can do. But there were some just unreasonable restrictions placed on them. So just give an example of something that was denied and in retrospect becomes extremely important. The FBI wanted to search Zacarias Moussaoui's computer. He was one of the hijackers that didn't make it onto the plane, the 19th hijacker, I think they called him. They wanted to search his computer prior to 9/11. I mean, they were investigating. They thought something was going on, and it was denied when they went to get the search warrant. So there was just these unreasonable legal restrictions. There was fear of lawsuits and appeals and possibly undermining a case in the future if a case is prosecuted against somebody. And they can point back at some point where there's supposedly some violation of their rights in the gathering information process. So some unreasonable restrictions. Again, there's a very good place for some restrictions, but these were unreasonable. These restrictions get expanded and magnified under Clinton's administration. There's some great animosity towards some of our agencies there, and these get magnified then. Again, there were some things there prior to him, and they get made worse. So we have these legal restrictions. That was one thing, roadblocks that our agencies hit as we tried to gather information. All right, the second thing is referred to as a wall of separation, this time not between the church and the state, but a wall of separation between the CIA and the FBI. The CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, it primarily deals with things outside of the country, gathering information about other countries and threats in other countries to America. The FBI is predominantly inside of America, investigating things here. And Congress had erected this wall between the two, where the two were not allowed to communicate, especially the CIA with the FBI. All right, the CIA outside of the country, there's not some of the constitutional restraints in America aren't there because they're outside of America. So there were the excuse was the CIA is going to use these extra constitutional means to gather information and then report back to the FBI, and the FBI is going to abuse that information, the knowledge of that information, here in the United States. So there's a wall of separation. So the CIA literally can know that there was some, a mass murderer from England that England was looking for. They can know that he came to America, and they weren't allowed to tell the FBI. They could not report that to the FBI. In this case, they would follow terrorists And once they crossed over into America, it became the responsibility of the FBI. And the CIA was not allowed to communicate that information from them, under the guise of protecting everybody's civil rights and that type of thing. Let me read you a quote here to me that is still mind-boggling. This is on September the 11th, 2001, the day of 9/11, not 2 days after. That evening, somebody from the CIA goes to the FBI. Al Soufan, this is the quote in the New York Times, Al Soufan, an FBI agent assigned to Al-Qaeda, FBI Inside America investigation, was taken aside on September the 12th, I'm sorry, I got the wrong date, September the 12th, and finally shown the names and photos of the men the CIA had known for more than a year and a half were in America. The planes that already struck, Soufan ran to the bathroom and retched. He was shown the pictures of the guys who hijacked the planes and flew them into the buildings and into the Pentagon and the one that crashed in Pennsylvania. He was shown their pictures. The CIA knew for a year and a half that these people were in America, but they were not allowed to communicate that information to the FBI. It was up to the FBI to find them on their own, and so that nobody's civil rights were violated. That wall of separation is almost exclusively a Clinton-era development. His liberal agenda and the liberal agenda of his agencies putting that thing together. So we have legal restrictions. We have this wall of separation that makes absolutely no sense. And then the third thing is public indifference. Right? It is just fair to say this was not what it is to us today. This was a secondary issue. It wasn't the primary thing when you thought about the world and safety and our threats. It wasn't terrorism. No, it was there. There were terrorist attacks, but it was something that happened over there. It was something, if you traveled to certain parts of the world, you had to be a little careful. Even Reagan, going back to him, and terrorism was a secondary issue. It was more something for the police to handle. It wasn't a national threat. Now, to be fair, when we go back to Reagan, especially Reagan and back, there was a much more significant threat in the world. Communism, right there in the middle of the Cold War, confronting the Soviet Union. So it's not necessarily a slam to say that this was a secondary issue, but it was public indifference by the leadership, by the people in the country. It wasn't as big a deal as it possibly should have been. So, all right, then the fourth thing, kind of tangling up a little bit with the public indifference, is that this was considered just a police matter, not a matter of war. All right, Bush changes that and makes it a matter of war, even calling it the war on terror. But for decades prior to 9/11, this was something for the police. For the most part, there's some exceptions. For the most part, some Americans get killed in Egypt. It's an investigation matter. We got to find out who's responsible, prosecute them. It's not something to bring the military in and invade or start bombing and things like that. A police matter for the most part. Again, there were some exceptions under Reagan. There was a time where the Air Force intercepted a plane with a terrorist on it that we wanted. Some things like that. But even in that situation, they get the plane down, get the guy off, and they turn the guy over to the court system. It's still not quite a war issue as it was today. So, all right, so we have that setting beforehand, the legal restrictions, the wall of separation, and then the indifference and the idea that it was a police matter, something for the police to issue, not necessarily a war affair or a matter of the predominant national safety or protection. It was a police matter. So, all right, again, 9/11 was very effective at crystallizing lots of people's vision to realize that there are some issues that had to be dealt with. So 9/11 hits. Bush, 9 days later, gives a speech. And in that speech, he outlines three main things that become the pillars of his approach to the war on terror. This is referred to as the Bush Doctrine. All right, first thing he did, it was kind of refreshing, especially in light of our current administration, the Obama administration at least, is that he called terrorism and the ideology that it fostered, the whole Islamic fascism ideology, called it evil. All right? He didn't beat around the bush. Now, there were things he said that really aggravated him, but here at least he just said, this is evil. This isn't, they're not misunderstood, they've not been abused and are trying to, fight for economic freedom. No, he said it was evil. He referred to the axis of evil in his speech. That was referring to Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, the axis of evil in the world. Another quote from his speech, "We are in a conflict between good and evil, and America will call evil by its name." So very upfront, this is evil. It's not a misunderstanding. It's not a different culture. It's evil, and they are the evil. All right, the second thing second point in his doctrine that he gives in his speech is that terrorism, the attacks on 9/11 and similar things around the world, this Islamic terrorism, was supported and encouraged by governments around the world. Right? It was not, as is still often the lie perpetuated even today, it was not the result of poverty or the result of disgruntled people in the Middle East. This was this ideology was something that was supported and encouraged by governments. It was paid for by governments around the world, encouraged by governments around the world, planned in a great extent by governments around the world. It was not this spontaneous uprising out of poverty or something like that. By acknowledging that this is something that governments are supporting and encouraging and paying for, then he goes after those countries, right? The countries that were at that point the ones behind this, he goes after. The first was Afghanistan, where Osama bin Laden was hiding out. Then he went into Iraq as the chief sponsors of terror in the world at that point, and even much still today. So anyway, that was by acknowledging that terrorism was a state activity. It was something from the governments were putting together and organizing. The government's often claiming, oh, this is some public, a natural uprising from America's oppressive foreign policy or something like that. They were paying for it, they were planning it, they were organizing it. So he goes after these countries. He refers to this attack on the government structures in those two places with phrases like draining the swamps, the swamp where mosquitoes would breed and disease, draining the swamp so that the breeding cannot take place. On a side note, Donald Rumsfeld was our Secretary of War at this point, Secretary of Defense at this point, and he was asked about Afghanistan, why we were dropping daisy cutters. It was a 15,000-pound bomb, and I don't know exactly how it worked, but as it got closer to the ground, it would shoot out projectiles that themselves would explode. So you have this giant area of just explosion taking place all at the same time, and I remember him saying this, and I still appreciate it. So we have this news conference where these reporters are saying, why are you dropping these daisy cutters? They're so violent and they're just so destructive. And he said, because we want to kill them. All right, still I appreciate that honesty. It was a war. We wanted to kill them. We weren't there to make them feel better, to address poverty. They were terrorists, and we wanted to kill them. All right, so that was the second facet here of the Bush Doctrine. We have that he calls it evil. We have that it was sponsored by governments around the world, and we were going to drain the government support from these agencies, from these terrorist groups. And then the third thing is called preemption. The idea that we were going to have to be proactive. We were going to have to go around the world and identify these threats and address them before they hit us again. Now again, this was a little bit controversial, but there's a very legitimate place for preemption. All right, it can get carried away. We shouldn't just walk around the world, so to speak, and just randomly kill people and claim, oh, we thought they might at some point in the future hurt us. But if we can identify a group of people that are making plans and actively involved in trying to attack America, we don't have to sit back and wait for the attack to come and then say, oh, they killed another 3,000 people. Now we can go kill them. No, the idea of preemption. He talked about illustrated with us the point of in a modern world, the next warning would be a mushroom cloud. So we can't wait for a nuclear explosion in a city. for us to say, okay, those guys are bad, we need to go address the problem. He was saying we're going to identify these places around the world, and we're going to stop the threat before it becomes the mushroom cloud. So the idea of preemption, again, there is a room for that to be abused, just like basically any policy, but there's a very legitimate point to that of preemption. I mentioned one other thing with preemption. We could think back to the Cold War, where there was nuclear weapons going off on both sides, or the threat of nuclear war on both sides. And there we had this policy of mutually assured destruction. And MAD was the policy. And you might think, well, why not do that with the terrorists? We warn them, if you guys blow up our cities, we're going to blow up your whole country. This mutually assured destruction. The difference here is we're dealing with people who want to commit suicide. They come over here and they kill themselves. They fly the plane into the building with them on it. They didn't take parachutes and jump out. These people are wanting to die. All right, so we're dealing with a very, very different ideology. The communists in the Soviet Union, for the most part, they wanted to live. They wanted to blow up America, but they wanted to live. They weren't hoping to go down in this glory of fire and smoke as they kill lots of Americans. So even going back to that policy of mutually assured destruction didn't really fit here with these terrorists, because they wanted to die. That threat wasn't a threat to them. It was something they hoped for. So the war on terror. From that point on, then Bush goes on to address these places around the world, especially Afghanistan and Iraq. And he gets abused in Congress very unfairly, and Congress yanks things around and makes a mess of things. But Bush's basic idea here, I think, is very, very appropriate. So the war on terror.